today. May everything we do say, honor, and glorify you, and may you truly open our hearts to your word. In the name of Jesus we pray.
Amen. All righty. So now here is our great task for the morning. We need to get all of chapter 12 done at one time. So the way I'm going to handle that is I'm not going to give you so much granular detail. We're going to paint this thing in sort of bigger strokes. Not because the granular detail isn't important, but because I don't want to get bogged down in it right now. And so as we get later into Revelation, we'll come back and hit some of this stuff, but I really want to blitz through kind of everything that's going on here. So let's read the whole chapter. And even a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. She was pregnant and was crying out in birth pains and the agony of giving birth. And another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his head 7 diadems. His tail swept down a third of the stars of heaven and cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she bore her child, he might devour it. She gave birth to a male child, one who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. But her child was caught up to God and to his throne, and the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God, in which she is to be nourished for 1260 days. Now war arose in heaven, Michael and his angels fighting against the dragon. And the dragon and his angels fought back, but he was defeated, and there was no longer any place for them in heaven. And the great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. And I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, Now the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ have come, for the accuser of our brothers has been thrown down, who accuses them day and night before our God. And they have conquered him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, for they loved not their lives even unto death. They're bound to you in great wrath, because he knows that his time is short. And when the dragon saw that he had been thrown down to the earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. The woman was given 2 wings of the great eagle, so that she might fly from the serpent into the wilderness, to the place where she is to be nourished for a time and times and half a time. The serpent poured water like a river out of his mouth after the woman, to sweep her away with a flood. But the earth came to the help of the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed the river that the dragon had poured from his mouth. Then the dragon became furious with the woman and went off to make war on the rest of her offspring, on those who keep the commandments of God and hold the testimony of Jesus. And he stood on the sand of the sea. So welcome to Symbolism Central and Biblical Theology 101, because John has at the same time given us this magical seeming picture. I mean, this is mythic stuff, right? We're not talking about 7 churches anymore. We're not even really talking about what we might expect to be going on in heaven. We have this really highly symbolic image of redemption history played out for us right here. And so just for our own help, or at least it was helpful to me, you can divide the next 3 chapters pretty helpfully. Chapter 12, we're talking about the enemy. The enemy. Chapters 13 through 14, verse 13, our refuge. And then chapter 14, verse 14 to chapter 15, verse 4, our Redeemer. So your enemy, your refuge, and your Redeemer. Now those aren't necessarily intentional designations in the text, but they have been helpful for me in trying to wrangle all of this. So, as I said, I want to blitz through this whole chapter. It's probably not going to be as in-depth as you expect of me, but this is one of those sections where I think we do more harm than good by trying to dig every meaning out of every word. Okay, this is a very visual section. So I think it'll be more helpful if we understand this in generous strokes rather than trying to paint a wall with a liner brush. Okay, so verses 1 to 2. This is language that ought to be familiar to us if we've been students of the Bible for very long, and particularly students of the Old Testament. Because John is using the language of Joseph's second dream from Genesis 37, verses 9 through 11. But the idea there, you'll remember, is that you have the sun and the moon and 11 stars, and they are bowing down to Joseph, right? And so that family, Joseph's family, is the family that becomes the 12 patriarchs. We know this from our biblical history. So then who is the woman? Because as we see there, the woman is clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head she has a crown of 12 stars. So not quite the same thing as Joseph saw, where they were bowing down to him. Some people have said, and I mean, in some ways this is the most natural reading, and I'm not going to tell you that this is maybe the correct reading, although I think it is in part, but the most natural reading is that this is Mary. Mary didn't give birth to the church, Jesus. So the most natural reading is Mary. Probably second to that, what some of you might think, is Eve. And again, any of these have an amount of correctness to them. I think it's kind of a conglomerate image here. You'll remember that from the beginning of the Genesis narrative, God told the serpent in the garden that he was going to put conflict between between the offspring of the woman and the serpent. And the outcome was already determined, right? The offspring will win. They will crush the head of the serpent. But over the course of the biblical narrative, we've seen numerous occasions where Satan has sought to destroy the promised child before that child puts an end to his dominion. All right? Cain and Abel, Pharaoh, Saul versus David, Haman, Herod, more particularly to get rid of that Davidic line, to get rid of that Messianic line. Now, let me tell you something, if you haven't already figured it out, for every earthly thing we experience, there's also a spiritual reality behind it. Right? This stuff doesn't just happen. So it is with the biblical narrative. So it is with redemption history. It's not just that Saul came against David. It's not just that Haman was coming against the Jewish people for political purposes. It's Satan using these people as tools to eliminate the threat against himself. All right? But now here in chapter 12, we see something sort of different. Because we have this woman, maybe Mary, maybe representative of Eve. In my view, she represents the faithful Israel, and the church is protected. The church is nourished in the wilderness, the church is protected. So pointing out her labor in pregnancy, John actually echoes, now again, I've said this before, we don't have enough Old Testament knowledge to do Revelation justice, really. But this ought to sound familiar because John is echoing those prophetic moments in the Old Testament where Israel is pictured as the pregnant mother. Isaiah is full of this stuff. The pregnant mother whose child is about to be delivered from captivity. For us, the new Exodus. Remember what I said about Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration? He's there with Elijah and Moses. Moses says, we're here concerning your Exodus. That's the word that Moses uses there. So it's this deliverance, this sense of just deliverance, this sense of being pulled away from bondage to something. We now have it on this grand cosmic scale. In verses 3 to 4, we encounter the great red dragon. This, Daniel chapter 7, verses 7 to 8. This is the fourth beast that Daniel identifies in Daniel 7. But the same language is used here. Now, we might have a hard time trying to figure out what this thing looks like, because we might be able to picture a seven-headed dragon. But then where do the crowns go? Is there one on each head? Is there a main head? Like, what are we doing here? If you jump to verse 9, you'll see that John is portraying Satan as the seven-headed Leviathan, the sea monster who is that fourth beast in Daniel 7. So verse 9 says, and the great dragon was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. And as we keep going, he's standing. This here, you don't have to do anything with this if you don't want to, but historically Rome was also known as a city set on 7 hills. And that was part of Rome's power in their mind, was that it was set on these 7 hills of authority. This is not in my notes, this is just free, but there, come on Gail, hold on to your cap. We have in prosperity gospel adjacent theology, let's call it that, something called dominionism. And it's this idea that Christians should, by whatever means necessary, take over every level of society. And it's sort of predicated, the images that go along with it are these hills, right? That we should sort of like conquer these hills, and there's 7 of them. So this idea of power being distributed across 7 hills is also pretty prevalent, even in Christian, albeit heretical, but Christian thinking. So we have this Leviathan, the 7-headed beast, Satan, Rome, a city set on 7 hills. Remember John's context. They're being oppressed. He started this thing out by writing letters to 7 churches who are being oppressed, and they're responding in a variety of ways to their oppression and their persecution. Some of them are doing it right, most of them are not. And now we have this cosmic scene in which we have the church and her offspring and the great dragon and that war that is happening. I told you last week 12 through 14 is all about war. So here we are. So this Leviathan image, again, very Old Testament. John is going to begin to increasingly rely on Psalms to do a lot of the figurative image work for him. So Psalm 74, verses 13 to 15, tells us something about Leviathan. He says, the psalmist says, "You divided the sea by your might. You broke the heads of the sea monsters on the waters. You crushed the heads of Leviathan." Now, we don't know how many. It doesn't give us a number, but it is plural. "You crushed the heads of Leviathan. You gave him his food for the creatures of the wilderness. You split open springs and brooks, and you dried up ever-flowing streams." Keep all that water imagery in the back of your mind as you think about the great dragon standing on the sands of the sea at the end of this, right? So this beast is powerful. He has a universal reach. But these crowns are crowns of tyranny, right? So Isaiah 27, again, doesn't give us the many heads of Leviathan, but here's what it has to say about Yahweh's future defeat of Leviathan. This is Isaiah 27, verse 1. "In that day, the Lord, with his hard and great and strong sword, will punish Leviathan, the fleeing serpent, Leviathan, the twisting serpent, and he will slay the dragon that is in the sea." Right? But we need to be careful, because John is making the closest possible connections between Satan, the great dragon, the Leviathan, and chapter 13, verse 1, the beast from the sea. Making those closely as he can, but they are not the same thing. But what it does tell us is the beast of the sea derives his power from the great dragon given to us here. So I think John's making that distinction blurry because he wants us to understand that all of these forces of evil are working together. They're all united for the same purpose. Some commentators have called the great dragon and the beast of the land and the beast of the sea the unholy trinity, right? Well, what do we know about the Holy Trinity? They're in agreement and have been since eternity past. So what can we expect from the unholy trinity? Satan's always copying God. And by the way, he's doing a deceptively good job. We can think things are God when they're not. And we have to be careful with that. So here, it seems that Satan is following that same pattern. Well, if God can be agreed among three, so can I, right? So as we move into verse 4, then, the dragon is further identified in terms of Daniel chapter 8, verse 10. Again, it's been a while since we were there, but in Daniel 8, verse 10, the enemy of God's people is described as a horn growing up even to the host of heaven, and some of the host and some of the stars it threw down to the ground and trampled on them. All right, now take what we have here in Revelation 12:4. "His tail swept down a third of the stars of heaven and cast them to the earth." So this is one of those moments where interpreting the stars isn't nearly as important as recognizing that his power and ability to sweep down the stars set his identity within this narrative. He is this thing that Daniel talked about. There is you can't make up the amount of continuity between Daniel and Revelation, right? I mean, it's where Daniel sort of leaves off, Revelation just picks up with this stuff. And they're separated by thousands of years. Now, for people who want to say that the Bible is unreliable and that it is man-made, you tell me how when you have that kind of agreement. So just as Daniel said in chapter 8. Now in Revelation, we have the tail of the dragon sweeping down a third of the stars. The stars, I think, are probably meant to imply angels. I think we can be safe there. Doesn't really matter. Point is, he can do it. And so verses 5 and 6 now pivot. And they tell us of this child who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. To interpret that verse eschatologically now as Jesus. He is the one who will bring judgment against the raging nations. And don't forget, chapter 11, verse 18, before we come into this section, what do the 24 elders sing? The nations raged, but your wrath came, and the time for the dead to be judged and for the rewarding of your servants, and so forth and so on. And now, here comes this child who is to rule the empire. Bring us back to Psalm 2, which is this royal psalm about the power of what John is interpreting as Jesus, to bring judgment against these nations. Now, this is also a masterful moment. Y'all know I get hung up on this stuff because English major, book nerd. But this is a testament to John's skillfulness as a writer, because in one sentence, his birth to his resurrection and ascension through the throne of heaven and his reign in heaven until he returns to earth. One sentence. And John symbolizes that period as the 1260 days. Now, we talked about this last week. If I'm correct that the two witnesses represent the church, and if I'm correct that the woman here represents the church, that 1260 days is used in both cases to describe protection. She's nourished in the wilderness for 1260 days. The two witnesses will prophesy for 1260 days, unharmed. So she goes to the wilderness. It brings us back to the church. We went to Jesus for just a minute. Now we're back to the church. She flies into the wilderness. 19. Describe the church as presently wandering in the wilderness, not unlike Israel wandering in the wilderness during the Exodus from Egypt. See, I don't know why this hasn't been done yet. In my reading and in my view, Revelation is, I'm going to say this loosely, a Christian Exodus narrative. It tells of the deliverance from evil. So, Exodus through Deuteronomy, getting Israel out of Egypt. But you have Revelation getting God's people out of the evil world. Now, that doesn't mean immune from it. That means the establishment of God's kingdom. They are being delivered from that into the promised land, into God's eternal kingdom. So in both cases, of the church and of Israel, the wilderness is used as a time of testing and refinement. Now, we don't like that. We don't like to be tested. We don't like to be refined because it hurts. Unpopular opinion. I think when churches, individual local churches, go through rough periods, it's because they're being tested and they're being refined. Now, we can respond or we cannot. And I think if we don't respond, we keep getting tested and we keep getting refined until either we get out of the way and let God do in us what he wants to do, or God gets us out of the way. And so what we see in Revelation over and over again is God's moving people out of the way. He's getting the earth out of the way. Those who are loyal to him, those who have preached and taught and believed and loved him and loved his word, they're the ones that are protected. But they're also the ones who are enduring the testing and the refinement. So after she goes into the wilderness, the child is snatched up, caught up to God in his throne. The NIV uses the word snatched. I think that's a better word. Snatched up to God. How? In the ascension. Jesus has died, Jesus has been resurrected, and he is ascended. He is snatched up. And the woman goes to the hiding place in the wilderness. Because God protects the church from the utter destruction of the dragon. If the dragon had his way, Jesus would have never come out of the tomb. There would never have been a church. It would have all been over with. I mean, we often like to say around Easter that the birth is all fine and dandy, but without the resurrection, there'd be no church. And that's true. But the flip side of that is there'd be no church, and Satan would have won. And that's been his attempt the whole time, is to win.
Just taking her to safety is, he told that earlier, I think Matthew, where he said, I'm going to establish it, and the gates of hell won't fail against it.
And what else does he say? I will neither leave you nor forsake you.
Right.
And what else does he say? I am with you always, even to the end of the age. I mean, there's this perpetual sense that Jesus might have ascended, but he's never left the church.
Right.
He has never left. So, God protects the church from utter destruction in the wilderness. And as usual, now we have that 1,260 days. First time we ever see that is Daniel chapter 7, and then it appears in Daniel 8, and then again in Daniel 12. So in the background now in Revelation of these 1,260 days, we have all of that Daniel stuff that we know, which basically tells us, again, my reading, that this is a symbol of the second coming. Until the new kingdom of God is established, evil is in control. And it is in that time that God protects the church. I really don't have time to run this rabbit, but I'm going to run it anyway. What is the church? Not the pew sitters. I mean, are there pew sitters who are part of the church? Yes, barely, but they're part of it. But it doesn't matter how many times you walk through that door and sit down out there, or you sit down back here. That doesn't make you the church. So we need not think, and I think we've done a bad job of this, small churches and big churches alike, we need not think that just because you associate yourself with a local fellowship that you're going to be part of these who are protected. Because your friends will be protected, your loved ones will be protected if they're part of it, but not you. And I think that's part of the warning here. So remember, 1,260 days of prophecy of the two witnesses. They are protected, they are not harmed. That 1,260 days is up, they are cut down, left lying in the road, essentially. Now the woman flees into the wilderness, verse 6, where she has a place prepared by God in which she is to be nourished for 1,260 days. Of these three chapters of 12, 13, and 14 does something kind of interesting, because John is weird on things that he sees. Our problem is, and I've said this since we started Revelation, we want to read, and what John is doing here is, this happened, also this is happening, also that is happening, also the other is happening. I mean, again, we have John, who has been translated into the divine realm, seeing the scope of human history from the divine, God's eye perspective, and trying to tell us about it. I don't care how apostle-y you are. I don't care if this was the beloved disciple. You can't do that in your human mind. Did he actually see these visions from God? Absolutely. But were they hard for him? Yes. And are they hard for us? Yes. Consider Daniel's reaction when he saw all of this. He got sick every time and fell flat on his face. What happens to John when Jesus appears to him at the beginning? He falls flat on his face. Metaphorically, we're going to fall flat on our face with all of this too, right? In that first word in chapter 7, you probably have and, then, or now. The Greek word is kai, and it can mean any one of those three. ESV chooses now. I don't like now. I think the King James might use and. I like and. I really, really don't like then. Because it's not a then. This is not relative to what's happened before. This is also going on. So perhaps a better word might be also. Also war arose in heaven. Or, as the NIV does it, just war arose in heaven. There's no, the NIV, war, it just says war. It doesn't have a now or an and or the, unless yours does.
On chapter 7?
12, verse 7. Yeah. Sorry, I'm like doing a fire hydrant thing this morning, so just hold on tight. The wilderness and so forth and so on, and you have war going on in heaven. Okay, now how are these two related? Well, first of all, the awkwardness that we feel with this is because of our own predicament of being in time. where all of this is happening outside of time. Remember, God doesn't play by our rules. He does, but he doesn't have to. Right? He sent Jesus in time, while he himself is beyond time. So the snatching up of the child, the ascension of Jesus, and the casting out of Satan are related to each other, so that the natural consequence of the ascension is that war breaks out in heaven and Satan is cast out. So John begins by using imagery from time past, but in the present, everything hinges on Christ's death, resurrection, took place through the resurrection of the slain lamb. Now, that might be a bit confusing to us. Because am I saying that Satan had unbridled access to everything until the ascension of Jesus? No. Jesus tells us in Luke chapter 10, I was there when Satan was cast out. But where was he? In eternity. We're into God's sovereignty, y'all. This is where we're sitting, is right inside the mind of God. And this is hard stuff. Now, John chooses to name for us Michael. It's unusual. John doesn't tell us the name of angels generally. There is no real biblical support for the named angels, actually. This comes up, we've talked about it a little bit, this comes up in some of those apocryphal and pseudepigraphal Jewish writings where the levels of angels are outlined, and then, or the rank, I forget which, of the 7 archangels. Michael is just automatically at this point, when John is writing in the Jewish mind, Michael is the leader of the angels. He is the top archangel. He's the head of the 7. He's it. So, if there's going to be war in heaven, who's going to go to war for God? Michael. All right. Now for John, the ultimate defeat of Satan happens at the cross. And it happens at the resurrection. And he makes that very clear to us in eternity past. So he allows these prehistoric moments and these historic moments merge the telling of this. So in the prehistoric moment, John tells us that Satan and his angels were defeated and there was no longer any place for them in heaven. On the other hand, it goes on moment in terms of its effect on the earth. So what we get is this kind of apocalyptic end of the world version of Genesis chapter 3, the fall. This is where my skills as a teacher fail, because I don't know that I can say this clearly. For the framework of Revelation, the end of the world started when Adam took a bite of the apple. That's the best way I know how to put it. The end of the world started, the Lamb was slain, all of that happened in that moment. Maybe before that, but for our sake, in that moment. So in Genesis 3, when God says to the serpent, the heel of the woman shall crush the head of the serpent. It's offspring of the woman has done this, because God is not operating on plan B. Jesus going to the cross was not plan B. Jesus resurrected was not plan B. The events of Revelation are not plan B. This is all plan A. It's all going how it's supposed to go. Why it's supposed to go? Well, okay. You spend the rest of your life trying to figure that one out and you won't get there. But this is the way it's supposed to be. And so for John, as he's outlining all of this and he's showing us all of this, we could go back to the seals. The seals show us the effects and the condition of humanity since sin entered the world. The 4 horsemen alone do that for us. Now we come here to 12 and we see all of this stuff going on with the woman and the dragon, and we've said it could be Eve, it could be Mary, it could be the church. Why can't it be all 3? Because that is the way that John sees the story. Over and over again, just one layer on top of the other.
Isn't there a narrative in the Old Testament where Satan rebelled against God and was cast down? I can't remember which one was it.
So, no. It's not actually in the Old Testament. What we actually comes from a poem in, I think, 1 Kings, in which there's a prophecy against, and I can't remember who it is. If somebody is more familiar, maybe you can help me. But there is a prophecy in which the prophet says to the king, In fact, let me just try to look. I think it's Kings 14. Or maybe I'm making this up. At any rate, I will find it and I will bring it back to you. And that language of what we associate with Lucifer is ascribed to this earthly king. That's the main bit where we get that. The rest of it is from a Renaissance poet named John Milton, who wrote Paradise Lost. And that is what has really captured our mind. Satan cast out of heaven like lightning. But really, and it's based out of this in Revelation. But as far as having a true narrative of what went on, not exactly. Not exactly. So, John's giving us all of this, and in the middle of it, he says to us, by the way, this is the ancient serpent called the devil. This is who he is. He is ancient, he is the devil, he is Satan, and he deceives the whole world. Right. So I hope this isn't as far as we get, but this might be as far as we get. Our programming is now interrupted by this loud voice in heaven saying, now the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ have come, for the accuser of our brothers has been thrown down, who accuses them day and night before our God. So this reminds us, and it reminds John's readers that we live in the already not yet. The kingdom of God has already come, but it is not yet fulfilled. We are redeemed, we are citizens, we are part of that kingdom, and yet we still wait. Not yet. In this time that we live, Satan is going to pursue the Lamb's people. Why? Because they constantly remind him of his defeat. His defeat through the death and resurrection of the Messiah. Now, I'm going to go out on a limb here, and I already know opinions vary on what I'm about to say. Mostly between me and the pastor. But in 1 Peter, where Peter tells us, in some variation, Jesus descended to hell, or something like that, go. Kevin and I have just agreed to disagree on that one. I believe he did go, because I believe Jesus went down there and told him not to. And I think he went down there and he declared his victory to the souls that were there. Now that's just me. Doesn't really matter, except Satan knows, by whatever means, Satan knows the death and the resurrection of Jesus sealed his fate. And so all he has now is to steal so that they don't wind up in heaven. Because what is the point of heaven? To glorify God. What is the point of salvation? To glorify God. What is the point of the earth? To hold the people so that they will glorify God. And Satan's end game is, we don't want God to get nearly as much glory as God wants. Which is all of it. And so does God say, well, as a matter of fact, actually I will get all of it, because after I defeat you, I'm going to destroy it all, and there will be a new kingdom and a new heaven and a new earth and a new Jerusalem, and that's where my people will be, and you won't be there anymore. Right? So it's all wrapped up in this.
Verse 12 covers.
That's right.
But he hasn't made so fired up because he knows he's been defeated, but he's just trying to minimize the defeat.
Yeah, I mean, we get this sort of reminder in 3 parts. In verse 10, we get that Christ's death and resurrection have led to the expulsion of Satan from heaven. In verse 11, we get that their victory over Satan in the present is the combined result of Christ's death and their own witness to it by their word. The question that Revelation wants us as believers to ask ourselves over and over again is, are we willing to die for this? I'm not asking you that. I don't want to know your answer. But you should consider it. Are you willing to die for this? Is that important to you? And then thirdly, just what Brother Glenn said, while heaven rejoices over Satan's defeat, God's people are about to experience the full fury of Satan's wrath. He's been kicked out. Nobody likes to get kicked out. Especially not out of heaven. I mean, think about that. All right, verses 11 and 12. Okay, if y'all will give me 5 more minutes, I can finish this. Verses 11 and 12. I don't think we need to say much more than that about 11 and 12. What I am going to say, and I'm just going to read this little paragraph to you from Nancy Guthrie. Y'all know I like Nancy Guthrie a lot. And she says, the message of Revelation to them and to you and me is your friends, your job, you might lose your life. But to live and die in the Lord will turn out for your blessing. To live your days on this earth all out for Christ, no matter what assault the devil sends your way, is true victory, not defeat. You won't regret it. Your life won't be over. You will awake to find yourself among the many who have laid down their lives for the gospel before you. Jesus himself will comfort and reward you. Even if you die for it, you're still better off. But it's something to the effect of whether I live or whether I die, I'm a winner either way. So now we'll jump to verses 13 to 17. Now, again, here we have a beautiful image, and I don't want to get bogged down in it. The woman flies on the wings she was given to a secret place in the wilderness to be nourished. And we've already seen that. Here are the people of God. These are the strangers and the aliens of the world, being protected that I will be with you always, even to the end of the age. And so they're not abandoned. They go to the wilderness to be nourished. Jesus regularly during his ministry goes to the wilderness to be alone with God, to nourish. Paul, after he has his Damascus Road experience, goes off somewhere else. We don't know about Paul for several years because presumably he goes off to deal with God. Here is sent into the wilderness to be protected and to be nourished. Jesus, I will be with you always to the end of the age. And so what John is saying here to his people is, you haven't been abandoned either. Being persecuted, yes. Abandoned, no. And during that time, Jesus provides spiritual protection for his people who are enduring tribulation, who are enduring persecution, and the Spirit is at work in and through them. How do we know that? Go back to the two witnesses. What kind of power are they given? I love this moment. This is like a Quentin Tarantino, Christopher Nolan, kind of like, I don't know, film moment. Because the dragon becomes angry and he goes to make war on the rest of her offspring, those who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus. That's still the church. And then he stood on the sand of the sea. Now, I just have this image. I don't know, I'm crazy, so I think about this stuff. But I just have this image of this big dragon sitting like with his feet on the edge of the sea and his wings sort of beating slowly. And you have the big cinematic music and it sort of zooms in onto the water and you just start seeing the bubbles rise. Because we're fixing to get that beast out of the sea. Did you understand any of it? I don't know, but we made it.